Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. My name is Paresh Gupta. I'm a technical marketing engineer in Cisco. And today, I guess I've been told to talk about day 0 and day 1 provisioning of Cisco MDS switches. So essentially, I can show you what exactly it takes to put MDS in production. And I've prepared some slides, so I'll obviously pass on the slides. You can take a look in them. But I don't really plan to follow the slides per se. I like to show you how things are done, and this session will get recorded, so you can refer back later and follow the script. Uh, Another thing is, I guess the whole slot is for 90 minutes. It does not take 90 minutes to configure MDS. It probably 15 minutes. Now, today we'll spend a few more minutes because I try to explain some features, but for sure we are not going for 90 minutes, right? So hopefully everybody will get some time back. If you have any questions, just let me know. Right, so essentially I divided this into 5 sections. And the basic section, I can explain how to boot the switch, the configuration, how to set up date and time, name server, NTP server, things like that. And also I'll explain how you create a user, because that user will be used by the Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller, or NDFC in short, to discover and manage the MDS switch. So that's one. The second thing is I can explain briefly about how you can manage the firmware, things like how you can copy, you can upgrade the switches. There are 2 ways to upgrade the switches. I'll explain them. One is the disruptive way. You should not be doing that in production. And the other way is the non-disruptive way, which we call as in-service software upgrade, or ISSU in short. So I'll show that. Then we'll talk about interfaces, how you can handle the interfaces. These are the interfaces on the switches that you would connect your storage ports or your server ports, or maybe to another switches, right? Then I can explain VSAN configuration, device aliases, zoning, things like that. And finally, very quickly, day 2 operations, things like how do you set up your NDFC as your syslog server, how do you configure SAN insights, maybe backup, reporting, traffic monitoring, things like that. Now, I'll also keep on switching between the command line interface, CLI, and NDFC, right? So depending on what you prefer to use, I'll cover both. The other thing is, these are the 2 scenarios I'm covering. The case 1 is a very simple environment where, let's say you just have one switch between your servers and your storage arrays, right? So maybe let's say you have a rack, or maybe you have 2 rack and you have a top of the rack switch with 24 ports or 48 ports or even 96 ports. And you don't plan to connect a lot more switches. So in this environment, we have a feature called Autozone. I'll demonstrate that. For that, you probably need 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to put a MDS switch into production, right? The other scenario that I'll show you today is, let's say you have an existing fabric, and that fabric can be a big fabric like the 2 switch fabric that I'm showing here. But the existing fabric can have only one switch. And what I'll show you today is like, how do you take a new switch that probably has been shipped to you from the factory, and then you configure that switch and add to the existing fabric, right? So these 2 cases I'll show you today. Okay, so let's start with the very beginning. And as I said, I don't plan to spend a lot of time on the slides. Whatever I'm going to show you today is part of the slides, right? So for you to refer back later. Okay, now when you log into the switch, sometimes, only sometimes, the switch may be in the loader prompt, right? And you can boot it in 2 ways. Now, sometimes what would happen if you run a command called dir, which stands for directory, you will see images like these, right? Now, I'll mention that MDS needs 2 kind of images. One is the kickstart image, right? You see kickstart in its name. The second image is the system image. So if these 2 images are on the boot flash of the switch, you can boot these images. But sometimes what happens, and I would mention that it's a very rare occurrence that when the switch arrives, there's no firmware shipped with it. I would believe probably 2 or 3 times I've heard of that. So in that case, what you can do, set up a TFTP server, and then, I have these steps here, something like this. So you set an IP address on the management port of the switch using the set IP command. Then you set the gateway if you need to route to that TFTP server. Otherwise, setting gateway is optional. And the third thing is just use the boot command and use the address of the TFTP server and the switch will boot, right? But because in my case, I have the images on the switch, what I can do, I can use the boot command and just use this to the kickstart image to boot, right? Now, because I'm doing it live, it will take a few minutes, right? So we'll get slowed down because of that, but hopefully it gives you an idea. It's a 9148V. It's the 64 gig 48 port switch. It boots fairly fast. You'll see that right now. If you're working with directors, that take a lot longer, right? So be aware of that, plan accordingly. The other thing I want to mention here is that on the loader prompt, we use the boot command, right? So, you can do question mark and enter and it will show you the commands that we have. But here I use the boot command. Once the kickstart image has booted, we come to the boot prompt. This is different from the loader prompt. And then you can do another directory command. And now you have to use the load command, right? Now you don't really have to remember these. As I said, it's part of the documentation, but now you use the system image, right? I'm not using kickstart image now, I'm using the system image and just load the switch or boot the switch. And I'll also mention whatever I'm showing you right now, it's pretty standard, very typical of almost all Cisco switches, not just MDS. You work with Nexus, Catalyst, even a lot of routers that we make in Cisco. It's the same process. We have the loader prompt, we have the boot command, and the load prompt, right? So any point of time, if you have worked with any Cisco switch, it's essentially the same process, right? Let it boot. I think it will take a few minutes. So we'll see it. But if there's anything interesting, while the switch boots, I want to mention, let's say for some case, if you're running or demonstrating something, you'd like to probably erase all the configuration on the switch. And there's a command which is write erase. So if you run that command, the switch is going to lose all its configuration. So next time if the switch boots, it will have nothing on it. But if you use the write erase command, the switch still has the IP address and the boot variable. So it knows what is the IP address on the management interface, and it also knows that what image it needs to use to boot next time. If you even want to erase that IP address and boot configuration, you can use the write erase boot command and then reload, right? If you do that, essentially it goes to the almost factory reset. However, recently we added a new feature. It's called secure erase. The only time you need to run this command, which is factory reset, is when, let's say, your switch breaks down and you want to send it back to Cisco. Or let's say there's an old switch, you want to decommission it, then you run this command, because what this command does, it securely erases all data from the disk, right? I guess there are some regulatory requirement, especially, defense sector, finance sector, that anytime any equipment goes out of data center, it must not contain any trace of how this device was used. So in that case, you would use factory reset. I guess it goes and writes zeros on the disk, the boot flash, at least 7 times, or whatever the standard says, right? But typically, you would not use the factory reset command unless you want to return the equipment. I already talked about boot and load command. As I said, this is part of the slides, so you can take a look at them. The set IP command and the set gateway command you'll use only when you're booting from TFTP, in case the images are not locally on the boot flash. And also you can set the IP address from the boot prompt. Sorry, not the command, but the boot prompt. Okay, let's take a look on our switch if it's booting up. Okay, so the switch has boot up, and one of the things we'll mention that it goes in this loop. And the loop is about a feature called power on auto provisioning. There are 2 ways to automatically provision a MDS switch. One is the network based. So you see the messages here, it says that it's looking for it sends a DHCP discover and looks for a DHCP server to assign an IP address on the switch. If you want to use that, for sure, you have to configure it before, but if you do not want to use that, that's fine. The switch keeps on asking for it. The other way of automatically provisioning an MDS switch is putting your configuration in the USB thumb drive and plugging into the switch, right? So that's why it looks for it. It's you see the message and it keeps on going in the loop. It's always looking for it. But right now, I don't plan to use the network-based power on auto provisioning or the USB-based auto configuration. So what I need to do here, just type yes here. It says, you see, the question is the other way around, right? It's an interesting way of asking the question. It says, do you want to abort? So yes, I want to abort this loop, right? So I can say yes. This is the first question. Do you want to enforce secure password standard? Yes, you should. You don't want me to tell you that. But because it's a lab environment, I'm going to skip no. You don't have to pay attention. You should always say yes. Choose a password. And after that, there's a setup utility, right? In Cisco or documentation, we call it as setup utility. I would say it's an older way of setting up switch. I don't use it. And I don't think you should use it either. It's a waste of time in my personal view. I like to take control of the things if I'm having access to the CLI. Obviously, I like to do it my way, not really going to 20, 30 questions and answering them. So I'm going to say no to this question here and just proceed, right? So it asks for login. So essentially whatever I added here, I'm going to put the same value. So admin, and then yeah, that's pretty much it. So switch has booted up. So I can do a few things. The first thing I like to do is like assign a name to the switch. So for that, I would have to say configure. It goes to config mode, and then I would use a command called switch name. And I like to give 191.48v-a. You can use any name, any meaningful name, doesn't matter. After the switch name, I like to assign IP address to the switch because right now I have the console access. And if you go back to the slides, I have mentioned that for what operations you need console access, right? So let's say if you're booting up switch from the loader prompt, you need the console access. The switch is not listening to the SSH connections yet. So first thing is you need to assign IP address to the switch. So for that, you would go to interface, management 0, and then say IP address, whatever IP address you want to assign, and your mask. Do a no shutdown. That's how we enable a port on Cisco devices, not just MDS switch. Any Cisco device, we use the command no shutdown. And then I also like to configure IP default gateway, whatever that is for you. Now at this time, because IP address is set, I can do a SSH session to the switch. But one thing I like to mention is that anytime you make a configuration change on the MDS switch, it is not saved by default. That means, let's say if I reboot the switch, all these changes that I made, the name that I assigned to the switch, the IP address that I assigned to the switch will not be retained. So it's extremely important that anytime you configure something, you run this command, copy running config to startup config, right? So there are two kind of configurations we have. One is the running config, which carries all these changes, and the other configuration is the startup config. So obviously, as the name suggests, the startup config is what we use to boot the switch. So this command, copy running config to startup config, is saving the configuration. So next time if the switch boots, it's going to have these changes that I just made. So now what I can do is now I can do a SSH session to the switch because I just assigned an IP address to it. And obviously if I reboot, so it's going to complain. So let me clear the SSH keys. That just a Linux thing, has got nothing to do with this Cisco. And this is the same password that I used to configure the switch, right? So this is my switch. Now, what other things I can do? I already assigned the IP address, the default gateways. I like to assign the NTP server. Now, it's not a mandatory requirement. You can set the clock by yourself, but if you like to use, I mean, you should. I mean, honestly, you should use, but totally your choice. Some people don't like to use it, so I'll leave it to you. But in my environment, I'll just copy the NTP server address from another switch. So you go to configure, use NTP server. This is one basic thing. Whatever time zone that you live in or your switch lives in, use that time zone. And then if you live in that part of the world where you follow some summertime, use that. Otherwise, totally skip that. The other thing I should use is now you can do some verification, like you can do some show clock. So it says time source is NTP. This is the time on the Pacific coast here, right? So looks like things are working well. This is another command that I use almost all the time. I mean, it shows you the firmware that I'm running on the switch. It shows me the name of the switch. It shows me a lot more details, the firmware, right? Hopefully, especially those of you who do not deal with MDS or Cisco switches that often, if you have background, in Brocade FOS CLI, I'm trying to make it very basic so that you get an idea that, how do you do something similar on MDF switches, right? That's why I'm just assuming that, you don't have much background on the MDS. The other thing, let's say I already spoke about how do you take backup of the config. Backup, saving the config, but let's say if you want to take the backup of the config. So first thing you should always do is, like, as I said, you should copy your running config to startup config. I already spoke about this command. This command is saving your configuration for the next time the switch boots. But the other thing you can do is actually you can take the backup of the configuration, and to take backup, all you have to do is like copy running config to somewhere. So there are a bunch of locations you can take on the boot flash, and you can say running config, and then I can put a date for today, whatever the date is, which is, and that's it. That's my backup. Now you can take the similar backup on a remote SCP server too, right? You can say SCP here, and then it's going to ask you, what's the server and blah, blah. All right. I'm not going to do that. Hopefully it gives you an idea that this is how you take. It's just a single command to take the backup of the switch config. There is a scheduler on the switch. You can run that and run this command by itself. Just like cron job on Linux, you can run a scheduler on the switch. Let's say every night it just copies your configuration to a remote SCP server. We also have this function in NDFC. I'll show you that in a few minutes. Right now, we have not discovered that switch by NDFC because before we do that, I want to show you something else. But you know what? For discovering by NDFC, because it takes a few minutes for NDFC to discover, and we are doing it live, right? So let me use this command. Essentially, it's creating a SNMP server user. The only thing I'm doing here, and let me type this command from the beginning so you get an idea what I'm talking about. So, I mean, there are a bunch of options. So you do user, and then whatever user you want to use. So I like to use NDFC user, and then I want to use network admin. Now, this is the role of this user, NDFC user. It's not a mandatory requirement to have the network admin privilege. But if, let's say, in the future, you like NDFC to make configuration changes on the switch, in that case, you must have network admin privilege. Otherwise, obviously, NDFC will not be able to make config change, right? So that's why I like to use network admin here. And then auth, you can use whatever you prefer. I generally prefer SHA AES. And also because of historic reasons. Yeah, but you can actually copy paste this command. Just make sure you change your password 0, right? And it's complaining because you remember in the very beginning, I said no to that question that which asked me, do you want to enforce some secure password? And so like, No, it's just a lab switch, but you should say yes to that question, as I said. Now, at this time, what I would do, I would go to NDFC server, or you know what, before that, let me show you one of the features that I was talking about, which is Autozone, uh, which would be, no, I think before that, we should talk about, let's say, copying your images to the switch. Now, as I said, there are two type of images that we use on MDS. One is called the kickstart and the other one is called system. I already spoke about that. If you want your switch to act as the SCP server, as in, let's say you are on a Windows machine or a Linux machine, you want to copy firmware from that server to the switch and you want to use switch as a SCP server, remember by default, it will not work. Your commands will fail. So you must enable that feature called feature SCP server, and only after that your commands will work, right? Just like the way I'm showing. You see there are copy commands in the black background. That command will not work if I do not enable feature SCP server on the switch, right? I know a lot of times new users run into that problem. It's a small little silly thing. Do not miss it, right? So configure that. And after that, yeah, just copy the images on the switch. And, if your switch is booting fresh, so because my switch, started fresh, so I should set these values, right? Otherwise, let's say the switch restarts, it will again go to the loader prompt, which I do not want it to go. So what I'll do directory, what's on the directory, and I go configure, I say boot system, boot flash, and this is my system image. Yeah, it's verifying. Let it verify. As I said, we are doing it live, so it will be slow and boot, kickstart, boot flash, and this is my kickstart image. And the final thing, I can make the verification. I can verify this using now show boot command. And you see right now it says that boot variables on next reload. Nothing is set. Right now the current variables is set. It says this nothing is set because I haven't really saved the config. So I must save the config by saying copy running config to startup config. And now if I run the same command, now it says the next beat reload, right? So it's very important you keep running that command copy running config to say to startup config, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. Like, on bare minimal, setting up your switch to boot image. Now, if you run the reload command, it restarts the switch disruptively, right? In production, if let's say you want to upgrade the firmware of the switch, you do not want to run the reload command because, as I said, it will bring down the traffic on the ports. For a non-disruptive upgrade, or what we call as the in-service software upgrade, you should run the command install all, right? So there's this command install all, and then you can say kickstart, right? So let's say if I'm running an older version and I want to upgrade to the 932A version, which is the latest firmware that we have, you can say kickstart and say boot flash and just copy paste this thing. And then what other options? System. As you see, anytime you can run a question mark, it will show you what other option you have, and just use, right? Now, the install all command or the ISSU process has an extensive set of checks and verifications before it starts the upgrade of the switch. So right now it's not upgrading my switch, it's just running those checks, and it's going to ask me many times, hey, do you want to proceed? We found something wrong. Go fix that. Go fix this, things like that. So there's nothing wrong right now, right? I don't have to worry that, hey, what's going to happen? Nothing. It's just like running some checks. On this 1RU switch, it will probably take 15 minutes to upgrade the switch. On bigger director platforms, 9700s, depending on how many modules you have on the switch, it may take an hour, 2 hours, right? As I said, it depends on the number of modules you have, right? Hopefully it gives you an idea that how you would non-disruptively upgrade a MDS switch. Just one command. It's as simple as that. You cannot make it easier than that within a single command, right? So this is what it is. It's install all command. Now, I'm not going to wait for it, obviously, right? I don't really want to upgrade. By the way, I cannot even upgrade the switch because remember, I'm running 932A and I'm trying to upgrade it to 932A just to show it to you, right? I don't want to upgrade it. So what I'm going to do, I'll interrupt the whole thing. It says really abort ISSU. So like, yes, really abort ISSU. So let's just abort it. Um, yeah, and it's just like standard messaging, but as I said, this is how you would upgrade or non-disruptively upgrade a MDS switch. Uh, you could also do it from NDFC. I'll show you that to you because we have not yet discovered the switch. Before we do that, I want to show you a feature called Autozone. Now, for that, let the switch. Okay, it found its piece, right? It just took a few minutes to come down. Now, the next thing, let's say if you have connected your storage ports and your host ports, you probably, I mean, that's something you like to do as soon as possible, that you want to start the traffic. So for that, the first thing you would like to do is like just verify the interfaces. So brief command is what I start with. You see that these are the 48 ports on the switch. This is the management port on the switch. Now, by default, if you look at you can do a show running config interface FC. I missed the FC part there, right? So this is the configuration. All the ports are disabled by default. So what I can do, go to configure interface FC1/1, go to 48. I mean, this is a lap switch, so I'm going to select all the interfaces and I'll do no shutdown. You probably can just select a few interfaces wherever you have connected the cables and you enable them. And if you do show interface brief, yeah, you see some of the ports have come up in F port. At 16 gig, these are H ports. Some other interfaces have come up like FC1/17 and 18, but looks like there's some problem with them. They were isolated for some reason. We'll go there in a few minutes. If you want to know what devices are these that have done a fabric login, or in short, floggy. So yeah, these are the devices. Looks like on FC1/3, 1/4, 1/5. If you do show FCNS, so floggy database is only the devices that have locally logged in to the switch, but FCNS, which is the name server database, it's distributed throughout the fabric, right? I mean, right now we just have one switch in the fabric, so it doesn't matter, but the FCNS database shows a lot more information because here we can show the FC4 type, so you can see some of the devices are initiators, while some of the devices are targets. Some of them support NVMe as well, right? Now, let's say I don't care much. I was like, hey, you know what? I just want to put this switch in production. I don't care about a lot more things. It's just a single switch fabric. Remember, if it's only a single switch fabric, you can actually put the switch in production in like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. I mean, the things that I just showed you, like setting the name, IP address, you can just copy paste the command, put it on the switch. But the key important thing is to create zones. And we have a feature for that called Autozone. And the way you would run is Autozone, enable. And the way this feature works, and that's it. As I said, it's not even taking 5 minutes. It's probably took 5 seconds. The way this feature works is that if you have a single switch, all the initiators are zoned with all the targets, right? Two initiators are not zoned with each other. Similarly, two targets are not zoned with each other. Only the single initiator and single target zones are created automatically. And the zone set is activated. So if I run the command show zone set active, you see I have all the zones created automatically, and you see the star here. By the way, this star indicates that the device has logged in, right? If you see if the device is logged out, let's say you plug out a cable or you shut down the server, you still see the zone on the switch, but you won't see the star here. In this case, all these zones are created, and now you can start the traffic, or you can, create a LAN on the storage array. You can map it to the server, and do your normal I/O. That's all it takes, right? As I said, if you plan to use the switch or only one switch between your storage arrays and your server, I highly recommend you use Autozone because of the simplicity, right? I guess in the last release, we started supporting up to 250 devices. Look at the official number. We keep on changing it, so I may be wrong there. But as I said, on a single switch, this is more than enough, the limit. And we have large zoning database tables on the switch, so you'll not run into scale problems. The other benefit of AutoZone is even in the future, let's say if you connect more devices, they will be automatically zoned, right? So the way I say it, if you run the switch for 3 to 5 years, you just run the command, this one, AutoZone enable once, and you never have to touch the switch. It's that powerful. Right, so that's my case one. If you remember in the very beginning, I said I'm going to demonstrate two cases, right? So case one, as you see here on the left, this is where I have a single switch fabric, and you should use AutoZone, and that's pretty much it, right? Run a command, single command.
So there are a couple of questions. What basis it will select the storage port while zoning? That's a question from Mayank.
And you really mean the AutoZone feature, right? The AutoZone feature uses the FC4 type. When a device logs into the Fabric channel fabric, it registers it. There are multiple steps. First thing is just fabric login, then it does a port login, then it does a process login, and it logs into the name server database on the fabric. And when it registers to the name server database, it also registers its initiator or the target type. So based on these values, it creates a single initiator, single target zones. Now, some end devices do not behave like this. They do not register their FC4 type. And in this case, AutoZone does not zone those devices at all, right? Yes, and then you would have to zone them manually, just like you would do the other way. I'll show you the other way in a few minutes.
Thank you, Paresh. Mayank, I hope we answered your question. There is one more from Tirumala saying, how will it affect on the newly connected initiators and target devices? Sorry, Mayank has a follow-up question. Let me go back to the follow-up question. It's again the same thing. How would you select the storage port, right? His follow-up question is, if there are multiple storage connected to the switch, how will it actually determine a port? That was his question.
If there are multiple targets connected on the same port or different ports, because there could be like NPIV scenario. I'll answer the question to both the things. So if, let's say, you have multiple switch ports that are connected to different storage ports, obviously they log in as target, as you see here, like this one and this one. So now we create single initiator and single target zones with both of them. So let's say you have 3 initiators and 2 targets. So the 3 initiators and 2 targets, so there would be like 3 multiplied by 2, 6 zones, right? The other scenario could be, let's say you have the same port, and on that port, multiple targets log in. That would be NPIV scenario. I guess more storage arrays are following that model these days. So even in this case, the answer is the same, because we actually create zones based on WWPN or the FCIDs, right? We don't do port-based zoning using AutoZone, right? And I don't believe that's the best practice anymore, probably back in the days, but we use FCIDs or PWWNs for zoning. So hopefully it answers the question. Otherwise, yeah, let me know if I didn't answer that.
Thank you, Paresh. I hope Mayank is satisfied. Okay. Okay, let me go back to other questions. There is one for Noor Fariha. How does AutoZone determine which initiator to be zoned to which target?
It creates single initiator, single target zones for all the initiators and all the targets, right? It's not going to differentiate or not going to leave behind some initiators or some targets for all of them, right? The answer is all of them.
Okay, I think it's a follow-up to the answer you said. If every initiator is zoned with all targets in switch, where is the security of the data?
So the security of the data comes from two places, multiple things, right? If you remember, we have a concept called default zoning. So default zoning is like no zoning at all. Like any device can talk to any device. With AutoZone, two targets cannot talk to each other, right? Similarly, two initiators cannot talk to each other. And this really helps because let's say if there's some kind of fabric stability event happen, we want to send a RSCN, the registered state change notification, then it is only sent to the devices in a fabric, right? So that's the security or the fabric or the fabric channel services piece of it. Now, obviously, I understand there would be some extra zones created that you may not want, right? So two approaches, or at least my thought to that, like there are two thoughts behind that. Number one, just because you create a zone, you still gonna go through your LAN masking step. So that's where the second level of security comes in play. Let's say if you still like to enforce zoning, then you use the semi-automatic way of AutoZone. And what I mean by that is, let's say we have 48 ports on the switch. And if you want to create, let's say, single initiator, single target zones among them, let's say there are 36 initiators, 12 targets. If you have to do that manually, it's a lot of work for you. So what you can do, use AutoZone, and I think AutoZone provides a way of just generating the config without applying them. By the way, whatever I'm talking, there's a detailed video that I created a few years earlier. It's available on YouTube. It demonstrates everything. One of the things I want to show is like, I think it just generates the config without really, applying the config. I probably forgot like what option is there. I'll refer you to that video. So the idea is that you generate the config and you do not apply that. So, and then what you do, you remove some of those zones that you do not want. So the simple way to do is, let's say if you have to walk 100 steps manually, let AutoZone walk those 100 steps, then you come back 20 steps. It saves a lot more effort, and you still have the best zoning, most restrictive zoning or the secure zoning that you like to use, right?
Okay. Paresh, a couple more regarding AutoZone again. AutoZone feature works from which version, and enabling it in production is it deceptive or not?
AutoZone we added in 2017, so it's been a while. Look at the release notes. It's been a while, as I said. Yeah. So the second part is whether it's disruptive. Look, typically you would like to do something like called AutoZone, right? When you're doing something fresh. Let's say you got a new switch, you want to put it in production, that's when you'll use it. In fact, if you have existing zones on the switch, you try to run the command will error out. It will say that, hey, you already have some zones on the switch and AutoZone will not work. So to use AutoZone, you have to start fresh. That means, it's probably the beginning of building a fabric. So, based on how you approach that question, whether it's disruptive or not, if you have an existing zone, as I said, AutoZone will not proceed. So the answer to your question, it's non-disruptive. Yeah, you should use it to create zones in the very beginning, right? So I will leave it there.
Okay, and one more. I think this is the last one we have now. If I have storage A and B and host name host1, I want only storage A should zone with host1. Will it work with AutoZone?
Okay, I just explained. Remember, I gave the example that you can run 100% with AutoZone and take step back by 20%. Looks like you guys want to do a lot more automatically, but not everything, right? And that small everything piece that you do not want to do, you can still achieve with AutoZone. There's a manual way of doing it. So it generates the config, but doesn't apply it. You can copy, paste, edit it, and then apply it, right? There's another question, I guess. Does it follow any naming Yes, it follows any the naming convention. It uses you see, this is the naming convention, AutoZone underscore. This is the serial number of the switch, and this number you see 1, 2, 3. These are just the numbers, right? right? So that's the naming convention it follows. And yep.
I think that's it. And everyone, thank you for your questions. And please use Q&A panel so that it's easier for tracking and answering. Thank you. Back to you, Paresh, again.
Okay, yeah, thank you for all the questions. That's really nice. Like you're asking questions, right? But you don't want me to talk too long, right? So that was case one. As I said, case one has a single switch between your storage ports and your servers. It's a single switch fabric. Use Autozone. I highly recommend that. Now let's talk about case two, where there is an existing fabric of any number of switches, doesn't really matter. But in this case, I'll demonstrate that there's a new switch and I'll connect it to the existing fabric, and let's see what happens after that. So we'll deal with VSANs and device alias, zoning and all that. By the way, I'm not really showing NDFC now because look, if your aim is to really run one switch and you want to use Autozone, I don't see any motivation to use NDFC at that time, right? Just too much work to manage one switch with another management application, but I'll still show you and then you decide if you want to use that or not, right? Now, before proceeding, what I'll do, I'll disable Autozone, and Autozone I can use delete and disable. Because I want to start fresh. I'm going to connect it to an existing fabric. See that? So they make it really interesting sometimes. I should not be using delete, disable. I should be using disable, delete. But I'm glad there's help. So if I do something wrong, it tells me what I'm doing wrong. And yes, I want to continue that because I want to demonstrate that how can I connect the switch to the existing fabric. Notice that when I use the command, it disables Autozone and it removes all the zones that were created by Autozone. So I can verify again, show zone, and there's nothing. Show zone set, and there's nothing, right? So now this is as good as a new switch, right? Whatever zoning changes I made, I reverted them back. So let's go. What would be the next steps? So I guess the next step would be, I think I should now discover the switch from NDFC, right? So the way you would do is, now remember I configured IP address on the switch and I created a user, NDFC user, right? So you need those two things to, for NDFC to manage the switch. So to discover the fabric, now I believe at least we have educated you a little bit on Nexus Dashboard and Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller. Essentially, Nexus Dashboard is the hosting platform. And on top of that, we run an application called Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller, in short, NDFC. It's a successor of Data Center Network Manager, or DCNM, right? I think that's all you need to remember for today. All right. Obviously, you should know more, but I'll leave it there. So most of the time to manage your SAN switches or MDS switches, you would be spending time on NDFC or Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller. And the next step I want to do is like discover a fabric. Now the discovery of an MDS switch is exactly the way it used to work on DCNM. For that, just the menu items have changed. So you should go to fabrics, right? Go to fabrics and then go under actions, say add fabric, and any name, any meaningful name, right? So I'll let you explore the good naming convention, but any meaningful name that makes sense to you, then use the same IP. So this is the IP that is assigned to the switch. Then I remember I used SHA AES, so I'm going to use the same thing. And then the password. You guys already know my password because it got recorded. And then if you have UCS servers, especially the UCS managers servers, you can discover that as well. This is not our conversation today, but I like to discover that. And that's pretty much it. right? Yeah, it just one thing I'll mention, and shouldn't be surprised, that you just need to uh, add IP address of one switch in a fabric. Now, remember, as of right now, I just have single switch in my fabric. So, that's all you need, even if you have more than one switches in the fabric. Now, it takes a few minutes for this fabric to proceed further. One thing I like to do here is like configure the performance. What it really means by is that if you want to start collecting the metrics or interface utilization, like how much traffic is entering and exiting on switch ports, you should enable this, right? This is a no-brainer, I guess. In one of the releases, will enable it by default, but right now it's not, right? So you should enable that and confirm, yes. And now I think let's just go back to the CLI because it takes a few minutes for NDFC to start discovering the switch. So we were here, and I think the next thing I want to do here is, because I want to connect the switch to the fabric. Now, before doing that, I like to do a few things. One thing is I like to create a VSAN. So I go to configure, say VSAN database. Then create a VSAN. I like to use number 20. Now remember, your VSAN number should be the same to the existing fabric VSAN. Just don't randomly create VSANs, right? And then assign the interfaces to VSAN. So I would have to do interface FC1/1, and I guess there's a range parameter here, so I can use all of the interfaces. And remember, changing the VSAN membership of an interface is disruptive process. That's what it's asking you. So again, VSAN assignment or the membership change, for an interfaces, you should be very careful. Plan it before. It's part of your initial provisioning, and you don't want to keep on changing later because it's disruptive. So the device will log out and do a fabric login again. Let me verify, so I can do show VSAN usage. So now I have two VSANs instead of one. Now I'll quickly mention about VSANs, and on Cisco MDS switches, VSANs are part of almost every feature, every fabric feature. You cannot disable them, and VSAN 1 is always there. There's no way to not have it. And all the commands have a VSAN scope as well. When we create zones, you'll see we create zones within the VSAN. It's absolutely okay to use VSAN 1 in production. I know there have been a lot of confusions. My guess why that confusion is out there, because a lot of people correlate VSANs and fiber channel fabric to VLANs in Ethernet networks. And in Ethernet networks, we never want to use VLAN 1 for production, right? Because whatever reason, and native VLAN and all that. We don't have problem like that in fiber channel. So it's okay if you do not want to add VSAN 20 here and just want to run your production traffic in VSAN 1, that's okay, right? Don't make it complex if you don't have to, right? Simplicity is king. So I'm just creating another VSAN to demonstrate, but in production, just use VSAN 1. That would be totally okay. I can do check on, so now you see the fabric login shows VSAN 20 here. And after creating the VSANs, it's time to add the switch to the fabric, but there are a few more best practices I like to follow. One thing is changing the zoning modes of the switch. So we have a feature called enhanced zoning. And I'm not sure whether we have actually explained all these features before, but enhanced zoning creates a single zoning sessions and prevents if two users simultaneously try to change the same zoning database, right? It prevents that accidental overwriting of zoning database by one user or of another user, things like that. It's an excellent feature. I not almost, I always recommend using it. So I'm going to enable that. The way you would do is zone mode enhanced VSAN 20. And remember, it's a per VSAN. Every command is a per VSAN scope. And because I have two VSANs on my switch, I like to do it for both. So that's enhanced zoning. I like to do the same thing for device alias database. So device alias database mode enhanced. Now, I don't see much thing here because, and you don't see a VSAN scope because device aliases are shared by all the VSANs. That's number one. And I believe in one of the later releases, we enabled device alias mode enhanced by default. So that's why you don't see much action after this command. The last thing I would mention is that about smart zoning. Right now, smart zoning is like on the similar thought of auto zoning. The difference is that, first of all, you have to create the zones. But instead of creating multiple single initiator, single target zones, what you can do is like add all these initiators and targets to the same zone. And the switch will automatically program the TCAM using the single initiator, single target zoning scheme. So it gives the best of both approaches, which is it simplifies your work because you don't have to create so many single initiator, single target zones, but it's very much optimized on the switch resources because the switch is really using or programming the single initiator and single target zones. And the way you would enable smart zoning is zone smart zoning. And by the way, you don't know commands, so just like do a question mark, right? Enable and then VSAN 20. Okay, and then VSAN 1. If the zoning modes are different among two switches, they will not merge. They will not make a fabric. So that's why before enabling an interface or enabling a port channel between the two switches, I'm enabling these zoning modes, right? So be aware of that, right? And if the links do not come up, it shows you why the link has not come up. Okay, I think this is the time to enable the port channel interface. Now, I have these two interfaces. Right now, they are isolated. So I can do show interface FC1/17. It tells me why it's isolated. It's isolated because, okay, it makes sense. Because the other side, I've already configured the port channel. This side, I've not. So what I'll do, I'll go to configure mode, interface, port channel 5. This number can be anything, but make sure it's more meaningful. Generally, what we suggest is that use the same number on both ends, both the switches. And then channel mode active. I think active we made it by default, but even if it's not default, even in the older releases, you should use active. It's some of the best practices. And then you no shutdown on this port. And then you use the members that you want to add to the port channel 5. Select all of them at the same time, and then command say channel group 5. So this number 5 must be the same as this number. And then, I like to force it. Yes, I know what I'm doing, so I like to force it. So, and then I can do shutdown, and then I can do no shutdown, right? And now I can wait a few seconds. Now, by the way, there are no logs being thrown on my terminal because I have not enabled them. I don't want to flood my terminal. Anytime you want to check the logs, you can do show log. Maybe go last 20. You don't want to dump everything, right? So this is the last logs. You see, this is when I shut down the interface. Okay, you see some logs have come up. Looks like my interfaces are up. So if I do show port channel summary, looks like my port channel interface is up. If I do show interface brief, okay, you see these two links are trunking now at 32 gig. They're part of port channel 5. And if I do show topology, it shows that port channel 5 on local switch is connected to a peer domain. The peer switch has a port channel number 5. This is the IP address of the peer switch, and this is the name of the peer switch. I can check how many more switches are there in the fabric, doing show FCSIE. Okay. So standard saying, see that the topology of the switches are listed separately for VSAN 1 and VSAN 20. Okay, because we have a VSAN based scope throughout the fabric. And honestly, this is all you need to do to add a new switch to an existing fabric. All your zoning database and your device alias database is automatically pulled from the existing fabric, and this switch joins the fabric. You don't have to do anything. If you set the zoning modes or device alias modes correctly on both the switches, it will work. And you can verify that. Takes a few minutes sometimes, so you can do a show device alias status. Okay, seems like this is the log taken by the NDFC when I added this. So the way, let's say if you run into this some kind of trouble, sometimes you see that you are unable to change the device alias database, and you see a log there, it's taken, so you can do a clear. And I'm glad we saw this problem, so that way I can show you how you would troubleshoot this problem. Show clear device alias session. So it takes a few minutes. Not really minutes, a second. Okay, the lock is gone. You could also do show zone status. Okay, see that it already got some zones. And where do these zones come from? These zones come from the existing fabric. It also has a zone set named 20. This zone set has 28 zones and rest of the information. If you just see, this is the time right now, and if I show you the time right now, sorry, the right now time is like almost like 9 p.m. And 3 minutes earlier, the zone set was activated. This is probably when the port channel interface came up, right? You can check the zone, so show zone, right? All the zoning information has come here. You can do a show zone set active. Right, so these are the active zones. These devices, as I said, the devices that have star before them, they have logged into the fabric. And let's see, show device alias. Has the device alias database has come up? Okay, you see there 152 device aliases came out of nowhere. They actually came from the existing fabric, right? So it's, as I said, it's as easy as to add an existing switch to the fabric. Now, I think the next thing, if you like to create a new zone, let's say show floggy database. I think before zone, let's try to do the device alias creation. So for that, you would do configure, you would go device alias database, and you would say device alias name, any meaningful name. Again, any meaningful name. I'm just using P60, whatever it makes sense to me. But if there's something else that makes sense to you, use that. And then you use PWWN and then use the thing from here. Okay, and then device alias commit. By doing commit, you are actually distributing this change throughout all the switches in the fabric. Remember, there are 3 or maybe 4 switches in my fabric. And if you do a show device alias status, you see now the number has moved 153. Earlier, this is number 153 right now. Earlier, we just ran this command, right? And you see it's 152. So this change has happened. If you would like to create zone, now remember the zone creation process is what? We need a zone set. Within the zone set, we can have multiple zones. Every zone has members. So that's the hierarchy. And then you can have multiple zone sets, the top level hierarchy, but only one zone set can be active. And the active zone set dictates the traffic forwarding, right? You can have multiple zone sets, but only one of them can be active. So let's try to do that. So let's just check what are the local devices, show floggy database, right? So I can create a zone. I can say zone name. Again, choose a meaningful name. VSAN 20. You must use VSAN scope all the time because VSAN zones in VSAN 1 have got nothing to do with zones in VSAN 20 and vice versa, right? So all the zones in different VSANs are separate. Now I would like to add members. So member, you can use all these different values to add the member. I can use PWWN, and I can use this PWWN. This is the initiator. Duplicate member. PWWN. Oh, hold on. Show zone C241. Now, I want to check if the Z. Okay, looks like the zone already exists, right? That's why it complained. So I shouldn't do that. I don't want to create something else. So show floggy database. So now I can do zone name C242 VSAN 20, right? This is the name of the zone. You see, this is because of enhanced zoning. It says the session has been created. That means no other user can now edit the zoning database until I'm done, right? And I can use member PWWN, this one. And I can use another target, maybe this time, this one, the P60 target that I created an alias for. That's it. And then I want to add, the second step is add this zone to the zone set. So show zone set active. This is my zone set. So zone names, no, ZS20. VSAN 20 member. Now here, the name of the member must be the zone that I just created, right? What? Did I copy it correctly? Okay. You see the problem that I did? I typed zone here. I did not type zone set, and that's why it ended up creating a zone by this name. I shouldn't have done that. That's a mistake, right? And I'm glad I'm making these mistakes so that I get to demonstrate the command must be zone set name ZS20 VSAN 20. And here member would be the name of the zone that I created earlier, right? Now it will work. Okay, and then now I need to activate the zone set, because right now, just because I added a new zone to the zone set, but it has not been activated, that means it will not affect the traffic flow. So to activate the zone set, I would do zone set activate name ZS20 VSAN 20. Now the traffic flow is activated. And remember, I had the enhanced zoning session. If I want to distribute this change throughout the fabric, I must do zone commit VSAN 20. And now it's done, right? So if I do show zone active, show zone name C242 active. Okay, you see it has taken effect, right? Okay, so hopefully that's making sense. You should create device aliases. Obviously, it gives meaning to all these long PWWNs. And then this is how you create zones. Don't do the mistakes that I did, right? Like, don't confuse zone sets with zone. You would create zones, you would add members to them, then you would take the zone, put it in a zone set, and then activate the zone set. And if you are using enhanced zoning, that you should, then you must commit the zone set as well, right? That's an important piece. Oh, and that's it. Now, if I have my LUN mapping correctly set up, if there are applications that are using that disk, there would be traffic flowing. So let me just verify. The way I would do traffic verification is show interface counters brief. I like to use this thing, and it looks like there's some traffic right now. The 5-minute average input rate on FC1/7 is 195 megabytes per second. There's more traffic on there. I can go and focus on a specific interface. I can do show interface FC1/7 counters. I can do counters detail. So there's a lot more traffic information, total frames in and out, link status, primitive signals, LR, LRR, things like that, congestion stats, TX weight, things like these, how many credits are there, how many of them are remaining, and so on. I mean, you can do these verifications, but essentially that's all you need, right? The next thing would be go to NDFC. And if you have any questions, Srinath, this may be a good time to ask while.
Yeah, Paresh, I see a couple of them. First one, what is the number of zone sets we can keep as backup, except the one being active?
So you really mean the number of zone sets? I don't
As a
remember that
backup.
number. Yeah, that number must be a lot. Like, yeah, I mean, look, maybe you want to keep 3, 4. You don't want to keep hundreds of zone sets. It's just going to confuse you more. I think the use case would be that I know some customers, and I'm talking about like large customers, they have so many zones, like they are hogging up all these scale limits. And what they do is like, they create different zone sets. Anytime they want to make a change, they clone the zone set, then they make the change in the cloned copy, and then they apply it back. So it just their operations way. It's I mean, to me, it doesn't really make sense, but it's their operational way. And even these customers have probably 2 or 3 copies. That's it. You don't want to have more. But if you're looking for the number, I would have to refer to the scalability document, and I think that will mention it. Right. I'm sorry, I don't remember that number on the top of my mind. So, and thank you, Gopi. I think you figured it out. Like, while I was doing it, you mentioned, yeah, thank you. I think you were paying attention. So, and then you also have a question. You have a doubt on zone commit. In some environment, I see zone commit is not working. Is this anything related with the FOs? FOS. Okay, we don't run FOS. That's a brocade operating system. We do NXOS here, but I get the point. So look, if the zone commit is not working, there could be many reasons. If you look at the documentation, it gives you many reasons why the zone commit may not work. We actually saw one of the problems, if you remember. You remember when I did the device alias command in the very beginning, it showed me the lock was taken by SNMP, and that SNMP is used by NDFC. So if another user has the lock, your commit will not go through. So that can be one of the reasons, but there could be more reasons, right? So yeah, it just depends what the problem is, right? So okay. Oh. The next thing I like to do is like, because we added the switch in the NDFC server, let's just go what happened here. And let's just see. So, all right. So look, it figured out, as I said, you just need to add one switch in a fabric, and it discovered all the switches in the fabric. You can take a look on the device aliases from here. If let's say you want to add a device alias, you just go here, say add device alias. And then obviously on GUI, it gets a lot more intuitive. You can say maybe port info contains, let's say 48V. I'm just interested in the devices that are connected to the switch that we are adding. And you can just select this one and select next and give it another meaningful name like P61 and save alias. What? Okay. That's it. Taken care. Pretty easy as compared to CLI, right? No mistakes, nothing, like no mistyping the CLI. That's all is needed. The other thing, let's say if you want to do zoning after that, you go to SAN and say zoning here. And it's the same concept as I said. You have a fabric here, then you have the VSAN scope, then you have the switch scope. Now, remember fabric A is what I added. Oh, so sometimes you may run into these problems. So I'm glad it's showing you what to do. The problem happens when there's a problem and nobody tells you what to do, right? I'm glad we are not running into that problem here. I mean, we are running into a problem, but they also tell us what to do, right? So I'm just going to do that. You run into the same problem, do the same thing, right? So now let's just select fabric A again. Remember, this is the fabric I just added. Go to VSAN 20 because that's what I'm using. If you don't want to use VSAN 20, as I said, you don't have to. It's totally okay. And then remember, this is my zone set, so I can click here. I can go and say I can edit zones and members. I can say action, create a new zone. I can say maybe demo zone. I mean, it's really a bad name, but I can use that because I'm really doing a demo, but you shouldn't use that. Oh, the zone name already exists. Fine. So guess what? What's my next name? Is demo zone 2. It's equally bad name. Come on. Even that exists. I'm gonna go with demo zone 3. I'm hoping, okay, it doesn't exist. Great. Demo zone 3, select that. There are no members inside it. So I can add existing members. I can say this is storage port, this is the host port, add members. After adding the members to a zone, what is the next step? Add the zone to the zone set. So add the zone set. I mean, all the buttons are right here. And finally, you can say activate zone set. And when you click on activate zone set, look, this is the beauty of GUI. This is the value of NDFC. It shows you what changed. You want to go cancel. And you know what? I should also remove this demo zone. I don't like it. So I just delete zone and delete zone. And now if I try to activate, look, it shows me all the change, right? I think that's really powerful. It can avoid a lot of mistakes that people may end up doing. At least you saw me, like how many times I was like going off. If I don't do this every day, that's totally okay. But at least the GUI is showing me what may be wrong. And then I can say, yeah, activate the zone set. And I wanna do that. Sure, I appreciate the GUI is asking me 2 times, 3 times, but I like to activate it. And you see some of the steps that it's taking. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Like, doing zoning configuration on NDFC, right? That's what it takes. Some other things that you can do, as I showed you in the very beginning, you can, or talked about it in the very beginning, didn't really show you, but you can select the fabric and you can say, you know what, configure the backup. So what really it's doing is that I'm telling NDFCs take backup of running config of all the switches in the fabric every day at 1 a.m. automatically, right? That's all. I want to also enable SAN insights on that. So, I mean, SAN insights, I guess, has been talked before, but look, back in the day, switches were dumb switches. They just provide connectivity between your storage arrays and your host. But now, especially on MDS switches, you can use the switches as your performance monitoring device. You can get visibility into every IO operations, like how long they are taking to complete, what is the throughput, IOPS, and so on. And then you can get end-to-end visibility between your VMs and your LUNs or namespace. And SAN Insights is the feature that does it, and enabling it is the easiest piece. So you see, I just selected Fabric, I say enable SAN Insights, then I do next here. I select my fabric. So I can say, yeah, I want to inspect both SCSI and NVMe. And then I want to say host, say next, next, select the interfaces on which I want to enable, next, and commit. That's it. So right now, NDFC is going and configuring 9148V switch, the new switch that we added to the fabric. And on all these interfaces, it's starting to inspect the traffic all the way to the headers, and then collecting the metrics and sending to the NDFC server. But looks like it failed, right? For some reason it failed. Now I'm not going to troubleshoot that, but hopefully it conveys the point that how you can enable it, right? Once you enable it, what you can do is like, or you know what, let me try to see that if I can quickly troubleshoot in 2 to 3 minutes. If it takes longer, then another day. We'll troubleshoot it another day. But let me try to configure it again, because I want to show you the what you get after that, right? I think that's the important part. So maybe this time I can use another switch on which I already have it set it up. Just next, and commit. Okay, let's give it like 30 seconds. As I said, if it takes more than that, maybe more than a minute or two, then yeah, we are moving on. So by the way, you probably realized that we kind of did day zero configuration a long time back. Now we are talking about taking backups. We are talking about SAN insights. This is all more of a day two operations. Your traffic is anyway flowing between your initiators and targets. So that's pretty much done. If you have your applications that are using remote, storage within your or LANs within your storage arrays, that are okay. Well, it worked in this time, so yeah, we can close it. And before we go look at SAN insights, the other thing you can do is like you can configure backup and restore. Image management. Remember, I explained in the very beginning that how you can use the Kickstart version and the system version from your CLI, but you can actually do the upgrades from here. This is the same, exactly the same thing that I showed you using the install all command on NXOS. Here, I mean, it's a simple step. You upload the images. Now, I don't have image, and uploading will take many minutes on the slow connection. So I'm not going to try that right now, but upload the image, then assign, create a policy that what switches do you want to install this uploaded image to, and then just upgrade. And it works beautifully, right? It's you can actually, I mean, it's really useful for those customers who have hundreds of switches. So now imagine doing one switch at a time. It's just a lot of work. So here you can create a policy and then assign the policy to, let's say, 20 switches over a weekend, and then upgrade all those 20 switches, automatically. I think it's really powerful if you upgrade at that scale. Other important thing might be, okay, port monitoring. So port monitoring is a feature that enables automatic alerting on the MDS switches based on many factors. You have some of the metrics here, something like, let's say if you have a lot of CRC errors on a link, if you have congestion on the link, which is TX wait, if you have overutilization on a link, so you set these policies. We have a lot of these templates by default, right? You can select one of these. If you do not know where to start, just go with default. I mean, honestly, this you cannot go wrong here, right? Because you have to start at one place, and eventually, if you're really careful, you would have to optimize these thresholds that you see. But just start with somewhere, and it's really easy to configure it after that. It's just like say SAN and like Fabric A and say push to this switch. This is my new switch. Remember, this is 9148 VA that we added, and just say push, right? So it's just like going to apply this config to the switch. Yeah, I want to proceed. Yes. So it's proceeding. Hopefully it works this time. Okay, it worked. Yes. I mean, it's really embarrassing if you try to show something during demonstration and it doesn't work, right? You saw that it happened a few minutes earlier during SAN Insights. So I'm glad it worked this time. Okay. So yeah, and right now, what's going to happen if any of these thresholds are exceeded on any of the ports on that 9148 VA switch, then the event will be sent here under event analytics on this NDFC server, which would be here. You see already there are a bunch of events. So you can actually, you should use NDFC for that purpose. And let's say if you want to forward these events somewhere else to Splunk or to a ServiceNow, you can do that as well. Right now, the last thing probably I want to show you, because we enable SAN Insights, right? You maybe click on SAN Insights, and this is how it looks. It shows you all the flow summary. It shows you how much the response time of all these storage arrays, what storage arrays or what end devices are taking the longest to complete. If you want to figure out why it's taking longer to complete, you just click on the device and takes you to some detailed investigation. As you can see, it looks like there's some what we focus on write command. So it looks like every 2 hours the write IO is, wow, it's 5 millisecond to complete. Like looks like it's getting 10 times worse. You see here it's somewhere around 500 microseconds, half a millisecond, and then here it's going around 5 milliseconds. So yeah, it's I mean, we have a lot more detail, like you can correlate it to the data access latencies, which tells you where the delay are coming from. Is it coming from a host or is it coming from a storage arrays? So remember, because I was working on write IOs, I'm going to focus on write IOs and disable read IOs, right? So looks like the DAL values are not changing. That really tells me that storage arrays is okay in this example. I should probably focus on the host or find some congestion issues in the SAN. You can correlate it to other metrics. One of the very important metric in these scenarios is the IO size. So I'm going to look at for IO size and see. And looks like it's a perfect match, right? If you look here, yeah, it's like this is 25 minutes after midnight. And this is exactly the same timestamp. So looks like the IO size is jumping. I mean, I would take a guess that some cron job running every 2 hours that spikes IO size, and that IO size spikes leads to the longer completion time values. That makes the application slow. So, I mean, this is how you can use SAN inside just one example. Obviously, it's a lot more detailed conversation. And there's something called a host view. So you can go things like that, detailed information about host, like how much IO is going on every path, like how many paths it has. It has 2 paths, so two out of 2 are up. But I mean, you see, this is a classic problem. I get to see this a lot of times that, hey, we got connected to both SAN A and SAN B and they are working okay. It's like, okay, how do you know? Our paths are up. As you see here, guess what? On the other path, there's no traffic. It's a classic problem. Something goes bad with Fabric A, they do cutover, or by the way, Fabric A was never ready. The login happened, but it was never ready, and you see a classic scenario here, right? I mean, separate topic altogether, but I see a problem here because of SAN insights, right? And you see they have the automatic topology. It goes. Remember a few minutes back, I said SAN insights give you end-to-end visibility between your VM traffic and your LANs. You get to see it right here, and you have the utilization charts here. I know I'm getting a bit on tangent here, but I just want to show you about that day 2 operations, that what you get after just enabling zoning on the switch. You can actually use it for your performance tool, right? Oh, one last thing I want to add, that I realize that most of the folks might be having a lot more experience in the brokerage switches, like somebody mentioned, Gopi mentioned FOS. So, years back, I wrote a document which maps the FOS commands to Cisco MDS and XOS commands. And then I took a table out of the document, put it in the deck. So when you get the slides, you will get hang of it. So something like if you do port show on FOS, you do show interface on an XOS. If you do NS show on FOS, you do show FCNS database on an XOS, right? So it's a small little cheat sheet that you can use, right?